Hello and welcome to the Tom's Hardware Show. I'm your host Sharon Harding, and today we're discussing Intel's 11th Gen Rocket League lineup. So we are live, everybody, and we are taking questions from the audience as always. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, just drop the question into the chat on YouTube or Facebook, and we'll try to discuss it on air. So joining me today is Tom's Hardware Senior Editor, Andrew Friedman. How are you, Andrew?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing good myself. We also have Tom's Hardware Deputy Managing Editor and CPU Chief, Paul Alcorn here. What's going on, Paul?
Nothing much. Another busy day.
Of course. That is your life. So Paul, Rocket League landed this week, and you have reviewed two CPUs from the lineup already, the i9-11900K and the i5-11600K. But let's start with Rocket League in general, because there are some changes there in general that lineup brings, like Cypress Cove, for example. So that's Intel's first new architecture, right, for desktop chips in 6 years. And they're promising a 19% uptick in IPC, or instructions per clock. What does that mean in actual use?
Well, just basically what it means is in each individual core is going to be much faster. And even according to our measurements, it is substantially faster than the previous gens, which were all based on Skylake for like the last 6 or 7 gens, I believe. I've lost count. They've been on Skylake so long, or Skylake derivatives. It's all basically the same thing. But higher IPC kind of floats all boats. It gives you more performance per core. And then when you spread out workloads over more cores for like threaded workloads, stuff like rendering, then that higher IPC gives you higher aggregate performance as well. And it also makes the chip more efficient. Usually it would make a chip more power efficient. And additionally, it make it faster in things like games and single thread work. So.
Okay, so you mentioned more efficient cores, and then also with this architecture, Rocket League tops out at 8 cores, right? So I guess in theory it's because those 8 cores are more efficient, so that's enough.
Well, okay, so basically Intel has a lot of objectives when they make a chip. And one of those objectives is they need integrated graphics. So because the OEM markets where they sell like pre-built desktops and stuff, a lot of those, the vast majority of those do not come with discrete graphics cards. So unlike AMD gives you more cores, but a lot of that is because they don't have graphics on their chips. If you don't have a discrete graphics card, you're out of luck for the majority of their chips. They have, lower end chips that have graphics. But with Intel, they want to put those graphics cores on there. So they have 32 of them. And that kind of eats up some of the die area. Also, when they created the new architecture, it was originally designed for 10 nanometers. So 10 nanometer for any given square millimeter has way more transistors than 14. So when they stepped back and they brought this design that's designed for 10 nanometer to 14 nanometer, everything gets bigger. The cores get bigger, the graphics cores get bigger. So both the CPU cores and the graphics cores are much larger than they were before. So they even had to use a larger die, and they just simply didn't have room to put more cores on there. Now, because each core is faster through IPC, they hoped to be faster than, or at least match the 10 core from the previous generation, but with only 8 cores. Unfortunately, they failed at that. In some cases, the 8 core model is slower than the previous gen, which had 10, which makes some sense, but it is a lot closer than you would imagine. So.
What do you think about that, Andrew, that strategy of, I guess, well, theoretically limiting core count, but having more efficient cores so you don't need as many?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, Paul's definitely the expert on this. From an outside perspective, someone who's looking at the systems and not the chips on their own, it seems like a move of very much a move of necessity. Not necessarily this is it doesn't seem, and I mean, no one's told me this is me speculating. but like it doesn't seem like it's not necessarily something they wanted to do, but something they had to do. You know, their best chips are still on 14 nanometer at the moment, and they really need to squeeze that. And to their credit, they've done an incredible job of squeezing it over the last several years. Like they've made a lot of chips showing just how well they are at really like squeezing every last drop out of those architectures that they make. But I mean, as we'll see, we saw both in Paul's reviews as well as a desktop OEM desktop review I did. It wasn't necessarily as perfect as everybody. I mean, I guess it wasn't as much of an advance as, I mean, frankly, its competitor has gotten by adding more cores. So, I mean, I'm really curious to see what a 10 nanometer desktop chip for Intel, an upcoming 7 nanometer desktop chip for Intel with more cores does. But we are a bit away from that. So this really seems like one, like we had to do something and this is our try, and it works in some areas.
Yeah.
You're so nice, Andrew. You're like, Intel was able to squeeze out everything they could. And some people are like, come on, Intel, move on.
I mean, in terms of backporting, make no mistake, backporting is an emergency measure by Intel. It's equivalent to breaking the glass and pulling the fire alarm. It's
I didn't want to use desperation, but
do what?
I didn't want to use the word desperation, but you have.
Yes, it is, because they have to remain competitive, and there's no way that they can continue to remain competitive with AMD on 7 nanometer with their 14. There's just no way with the current architecture. So they had to make a drastic decision, and backporting is a drastic decision. And, you know, it's full of risks. And I equate it to kind of like an emergency parachute, right? It's an emergency measure so that they can remain competitive. But it's kind of like an emergency parachute that opens 30 feet above the ground. You know, you're not going to die, but you might break your legs. So it's, you know, they did good considering the circumstances. I mean, it is a feat of engineering, make no mistake. But you do see the shortcomings of that approach in these chips.
All right, yeah, so let's talk about it. Let's start with the i9-11900K. So MSRP 539, 8 cores. What are your overall impressions, Paul?
Okay, so number one, I was surprised that they raised the price. It's I would have to look real fast, but I believe it's $30 more off the top of my head than the previous gen model that had 10 cores. Now, of course, it's more than that. It's $51 more expensive than the previous gen model. So that was kind of surprising. In order to command that kind of a price, you would need maybe a multitude of factors. Number one, you need to beat AMD in gaming. You need to do it in a way that is meaningful. It can't be a few frames per second. It can't be or even. You know, it can't just match them. You need a pretty big delta. You need to be out ahead of them. It's either that or the decision making behind raising the price is that people will have no choice but to buy your chip because you can't find AMD chips at retail. And I think it's probably a little bit of the latter. They can charge what they want because AMD's chips, frankly, are extremely hard to find, especially at MSRP. So when you look at the 5900X is the chip that you would compare to the 11900K because it's roughly the same price. It's $10 more at $549, but you can't find that chip. So, and when you do, it is often far above MSRP by at least $100. You know, now that does change from day to day, but by and large, AMD cannot satisfy demand. So, you know, Intel's free to charge what they can, and I think here they're putting their toe in the waters to see what they can charge. But I don't think that the performance justifies the price tag because the 5900X comes with 12 cores and 24 threads. So it's going to beat the 11900K with 8 cores and 16 threads just by default in any kind of threaded workload, rendering, encoding, you know, if you're running a bunch of apps at the same time, if you're streaming and gaming, those types of applications, the 5900X is just going to win by default. And well, you know, given the speed of its cores, you know, if you had those cores were slower, it wouldn't be so lopsided. So you have to beat them in gaming, and you have to beat in, which is largely single threaded, and you would have to do it by a fairly substantial amount. Now they did do decent And I mean, essentially tied. We tested with a RTX 3090. So, I mean, it's pushing the 3090 pretty hard. And at stock settings, it's, it's right. It's like 3 frames per second behind a 5900X. That's not going to be noticeable to most folks, right? But it doesn't win. And I think it would need to win by a considerable margin to justify the price tag. So I don't believe it's a good deal to buy, either for multi-threaded work or for single-threaded work or gaming. So, but if it's all you can find,
right. I mean, is it a good deal if AMD prices weren't? I mean, I guess you said you can't even find AMD chips at their MSRP anyway. So,
correct.
Okay.
If we lived in a fantasy world where both chips were available at the recommended suggested pricing, I would still recommend the 5900X over the 11900K. If the 5900X is $50 more, $100 more, well, then that paradigm changes, and then you should probably look to the 11900K at that point.
So we do have a question on pricing from the audience from Naomi Zak. How much of the price raise was a result of supply chain issues? Intel may not have had a choice.
That's correct. There are a lot of factors involved here, but one thing to keep in mind is that Intel is an IDM, so an integrated device manufacturer. So they create their own chips. They manufacture their own chips, whereas AMD actually doesn't fabricate a single chip. They pay an outside firm to do so. As a result of Intel's IDM, as they call it, the IDM advantage, it is an advantage in terms of supply. They control their supply chains. They have a lot more control over everything. And we've seen that throughout this shortage. While AMD is facing massive chip crunches, you don't hear that about Intel. Intel has chips on the shelves. During the holiday season, you couldn't find an AMD chip even 2 gens back to save your life. But Intel's chips were selling at a discount. You have Black Friday sales where they were below MSRP. So supply could factor into that, but I don't believe it's as much of a concern here. Part of the reason why they may have raised the prices, what might also factor in is the die is larger. So even though they have fewer cores, the cores are bigger, and the graphics cores, they have more graphics cores than the previous gen. And additionally, each of those graphics cores are larger. So the die is larger. It's roughly 34 to 36% larger, the actual chunk of silicon. So that does lead to increased manufacturing cost. But at the same time, Intel's 14 nanometer is ultra mature, so their yields are extremely good, and they should own most of their equipment. So, there's a lot of factors, but I think some of it is testing the waters.
I think, this year and all of last year in tech was just like plagued by supply issues and things like that. Curious what you guys think. How much like slack or cred do you give to a company who, maybe their stuff is a little overpriced, but at least they're available and in stock? And because there's some, like Paul said, you can't even find AMD chips at MSRP. So.
I mean, that's their business, right? It's making their own chips. So like if they didn't have chips, that would look way worse.
Yeah. I mean, you're going to have to make the decision do you want to wait to try to find a chip? Do you want to pay more than the suggested retail price? Or is there something that you can pull the trigger on that's very close? And when you look at, for instance, if you're just interested in gaming, most people are going to look at these gaming charts and say, okay, with a 3090, it's like 3 FPS between them. So with a 3080, the difference is 0. And that's at 1080p. So, if you come back to a larger resolution, for most folks that are not running a 3090, these chips are functionally the same. You won't notice the difference in gaming. So they'll probably pull the trigger on the 11900K if that's all that's there.
So we have another question from Javier Perea. Hi, Javier. They ask, am I correct in assuming that next gen will have the same performance, just with lower temperatures because it will be 10 nanometer?
I would not.
School us, Paul.
Okay. So the next generation is going to introduce basically what we would refer to typically as big little to desktop x86 processors for the first time. They're going to have large cores for high performance, and then they're going to have smaller efficiency cores. That is going to change the paradigm entirely. Now, right now, there are a lot of speculation is, and it seems like it might be about on the mark, is that the small cores will be about as fast as Skylake. Now, if that's true, that's going to be pretty powerful for a small core. And then you'll have a bunch of big cores on a more advanced architecture. So, 10 nanometers should be better in a lot of respects. There's no doubt. But the real question is going to be, how does software navigate the new design of chips? Because some things have to land in the fast cores and some things need to land in the slow cores for it to work correctly. This really hasn't been done with x86 in a desktop environment yet. So I think we'll see a lot more problems there. It will be interesting.
Okay, so Paul, you also reviewed the i5 11600K, which was pretty interesting because it's a more attainable price. It's $262 MSRP, 6 cores, and you say it stacks up against the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is especially interesting because that was your pick for best gaming CPU before you did this Intel review. So where does it stand now?
So the big story here is you have the 5600X at recommended pricing, which you probably can't find. Hold on here. It is at, I can read my own chart here, $300. Now for $262, you have the Core i5 11600K, and it matches pretty much. I mean, it's close. At stock settings, it is behind, again, with a 3090 by like 10 FPS. But if you overclock it, which is dead simple, it will match the 5600X. But you're also paying significantly less money for that chip. Additionally, you can get, Intel has F series models that come without integrated graphics, and they give you a discount for those. And for the 10600K, you should be able to get those around $237. So you're looking at about $60 cheaper, assuming you could even find the 5600S at 5600X at retail at suggested pricing. And you are very comparable in performance on games. You are very, very close. Those two chips, in a blind test, especially with something like a 3080 or a 3070, I bet you couldn't tell the difference. And additionally, the problem with the 11900K is it doesn't beat the 5900X or even come close in threaded workloads. So you get one half of the equation, you get gamings, but you miss out on this other half, which is threaded stuff, right? With the 11600K, it's extremely close in threaded workloads with the 5600X. They are so close that I think given the pricing, the 11600K is a heck of a buy. It is, especially if you could get it without graphics for $237. It would be really hard to make an argument for the 5600X over that, considering just all of the factors that are going on right now. I mean, the 11600K is actually faster at multi-threaded workloads than the 5600X, if slightly. This is probably the real chip that everybody will want, though. This is the 11400, right? 6 cores, 12 threads. I haven't even opened it yet, but I'm about to test it. This chip is, if I can scroll up here real fast, I'll tell you the price. This is going to be your value chip that probably the majority of people will go after.
Yeah, but it doesn't have like the wavy plastic box. So,
it doesn't have the wavy plastic box, but it is $157, right? So you're looking at almost half the price of the 5600X, and it's going to be, I mean, not as fast. You'll lose a little bit of performance, but it will be competitive. If you pair it with like a B560 motherboard, this is going to be your value chip. Because you look at AMD, the problem with AMD's current lineup is they don't have a chip below for their newest series of chips. They don't have a chip below the 5600X, which is $300. So when you're looking at half the price, and this chip will be faster than the Ryzen 5 3600, which would be the closest comparison from AMD at this price point, which is a previous gen chip, this will be better. So this will be a really interesting chip to test.
I want you to smash it live on air, Paul. Just like break it into bits.
Yes.
So I wanted to come back to the i5 11600K because you mentioned you can overclock it to get AMD 5600X level performance. And first I wanted to ask, because you said it was dead simple. Why is it so simple first?
Well, because, okay, so in terms of overclocking, you can get really complex, right? You might have to mess with like ring ratios and memory overclocking. You have multiple gears and, you know, frequencies and voltages, blah, 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 blah. But with the 11600K, I mean, really, if you go in there and you dial in something around 1.45 volts on your V core, you can bump the cores up to 5.0. Just it's simple. It's one of the easiest chips I've ever overclocked. There just really are not a lot of variables. I mean, there are a ton of variables if you choose to use them and really fine tune your chip. I mean, there's as many overclocking knobs, bells, and whistles as you could possibly, more than you'll ever need. Like you can disable hyper threading on certain cores and do all kinds of things to boost your clock rates, but you don't need to do any of that. You can dial in 5.0 all day long, just simple. So when I run the overclocking test for our reviews, I can always go higher. But what I want to do is reflect something that is, is reflective of what a normal user could easily attain with its standard cooling. So with a 280 millimeter liquid cooler, the Corsair H115i, dialing it into 5.0 is dead simple. I can tell you most people could do it pretty simple.
I'm curious, Andrew, what you think about that. You're a normal person, I'd say, more or less. Are you interested in buying, let's say, this chip and let's say you wanted like 5600X level of performance. Would you be down to buy this chip and count on overclocking it yourself? If it's, Paul is saying it's doable, you're not a pro overclocker, Andrew. I know. No. That's why I call you normal.
Yeah. No, I get it. Like, to a certain degree, I would say for a lot of people don't, and I've spoken to our managing editor, Matt likes to say this a lot, and I've taken this from him, which is that, if you want to overclock, just like buy the next chip. Like that's the easiest way if you want to like keep some hair on your head to do it that way. Intel has some utilities that they still offer that allow some of that. So I would definitely use those. I know a lot of motherboards have some auto overclocking features. I've used my own. So like in that way to get a little extra. But I think the pure value that Paul's talking about is what sounds exciting, and why I'm looking forward to his review is just like the idea of a processor that A, people will be able to buy, and B, that they'll be able to afford. Yeah,
and when you look at overclocking, Intel has a tool called IPM, and we have a very detailed review of that. And it's the Intel Performance Maximizer, and it overclocks your chip for you. You don't have to do anything. You just download it and you run it, and it takes a little while, but you don't do anything. It takes care of all of it. It'll give you a 5.0 gigahertz to overclock on an 11600K all day long because it's a very simple overclock. So, a lot of it, I guess it just depends on who you are, what you wish to do with your computer. But there are even other ways to do it. You can just lift power limits and things like that.
Yeah, to be fair, what might be dead simple to a Paul Alcorn might not be simple to some of us lesser beings out there. Yeah. So I'm happy to see we have some viewer questions coming in. I see we have a question on the 11700K for one, but we actually did a review, or I should say Andrew did a review of an MSI desktop with that chip. So maybe let's get into that. Keep the questions coming. We'll get into those in a little bit. But Andrew, maybe I'll kick it over to you. What can you tell us about the MSI Aegis RS 11th that you just reviewed?
Sure. So the Aegis, which I'll fully admit to having looked up prior to the show to confirm how to pronounce it, is one of Intel's, they refer to it as their built in America or made in America system, which is a bit of a misnomer. All the parts are still the same, but they apparently assembled them out in California. So that's why they refer to it as that. And they say because it's built there, they're able to put in the newest chips like this one first. So this is very much, part of a trend of desktops that feel like you could have built this yourself, which I like because it means a little bit down the line, you're going to see something where, oh, I can swap out this motherboard, I can swap out this processor, I could add more RAM. And that's often very difficult in a lot of designs because they're made in a way that's supposed to be very innovative. Like, oh, okay, so you seem like your Alienware or like the HP Omen, they look really nice, but there's often like a screw in a weird place or less room to get to the back panel. But this is all largely MSI parts. They make the motherboard, the case is a standard case, the Gagne 110R. It's their own RTX 3080. And it's going to start selling in this month. But of course, the interesting part is the i7 11700K. We saw it paired with the RTX 3080 Ventus, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and they also included SSD and the hard drive. And I compared it a lot to the 10900K, the last generation of Intel chip, because that was a really popular one for OEMs to use. And in gaming, I think it showed a lot of the same trends that Paul saw in his reviews, and that it did better, but like a couple frames better was typically where we saw it, and not always. They often used the similar GPUs. The Alienware used the 3090, so that almost always won. But where it did better, it did a little better than even the 10900K. In productivity performance, the single core was often better, but multi-core, it still couldn't beat last generation chips that have more cores. 8 cores versus 10 cores, which one's going to win? And there was your answer there. As a whole, though, the computer is really enticing, right? It's like really easy to upgrade. It's got off-the-shelf parts. It comes with actually decent pack-in peripherals. Like if you don't have a mouse and a keyboard and you want it, like I wouldn't say not to replace them, but like if you didn't run out immediately, it would be fine. There is the one interesting thing about this beyond the processor is this is also the first one we saw with MSI's new software, the MSI Center, like not Dragon Center, not Creator Center, just Center, and they're merging them together. And for the people who use that software, either for like their overclocking or their system monitoring, they might find it a little clunkier than it used to be. Like the software didn't feel done yet. They actually have it as a bunch of modules that you could download individually. And so that needs to be worked on. But if you're looking there are a lot of people I think right now they're looking at more than they used to at buying a pre-built because they can't find the parts on their own. It might not be what they want to do, but if you could find all the parts, that's great. And that's my big question with this one. So obviously it's going to go on sale this month. The 11700K, I believe you'll be able to find somewhere. That 3080, I don't know. But so I'm curious to see when this goes on sale, how many there are. But in general, this was a pretty solid pre-built that kind of feels like one you'd build yourself. The reason I say that is one thing I said in the review is when you take off the back panel, I know there's a picture of it somewhere in there, but the cable management was like how I would do cable management, which is say it was fine, but it was a little surprised not to see it like a little neater coming straight out of the factory. But overall, like it's powerful. Again, like I think a lot of people would have preferred the Ryzen if they could find it, but the 11700K did a solid job in gaming performance overall.
There we are. Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So let's get to Javier's question on the chip, which was, would you recommend the 11700K at $400 over the 5800X at $450? Is it not funny that we also have a huge gap between the 11600K and 11700K, like an AMD? So I guess we'll start with the question, would you recommend the 11700K at $400 versus a 5800X at $450? Either of you have a thought on that?
I would take the 5800X. Honestly, the 11700K. Okay, the attraction of the 11700K is going to be that it is essentially the same thing as the 11900K. Intel didn't send it out to reviewers like you had to buy it if you wanted to test it, because it is they're not necessarily looking to promote that chip because it's cheaper and it's going to give you the same performance. Very close. It's going to give you, because it's also 8 cores and 16 threads. I mean, the only difference between those two chips is the ABT tech, which is like an all-core boosting. So, 100 or 200 megahertz of frequency. in actual use, especially if you're using it over a long duration of time, like your workload, the difference between those chips is going to be minimal. So some people will look at it as the value alternative to the 11900K, but at the same time, the 5800X is going to give you more than the 11700. So, I mean, I would recommend the 5800X is, even when we reviewed it, is always kind of like a dicey value prop because the 5600X is so good. And the 5900X is only a little bit more. And that's why they price those. Like you're mentioning, the pricing difference between them is the delta is very slim. And that's a lot of reason why these companies do it, because then you look at it and you're like, if I only spend $100 more, and that's, so.
That being said, when was the last time you saw the 5800X at MSRP?
Exactly. You're not going to find 5800. I mean,
yes, I think I totally understand why the question asker is asking the question they're asking, but you're at definitely, I don't know how long this is going to go on, right? But the idea that is actually the price is kind of funny, because I don't remember the last time I was on Amazon or eBay or whatever, and I saw the $450 price, that it wasn't possibly even several hundreds dollar higher. So just so much is going to matter as on what people can find, right? And I mean, I know there are a lot of people really excited about Ryzen. I totally get one. I totally get it. I have, I would consider it myself, but if you can get the 11700K at 400 and you can't get the 5800X for anyone near MSRP, that might make you reconsider, when you're not basing it purely on specs, but just on what you can find when you're ready to build.
So is there an AMD version of the MSI desktop you reviewed, Andrew?
As far as I understand, not this one, not now. That's not to say never, that they'll never make it. For as long as I've been doing desktops, Intel has been slightly more popular with the OEMs. There have been AMD models. Alienware has its AMD model. They had the most recent one at CES. HP has started doing both Intel and AMD. But in a lot of desktops, Intel is still the way to go. And I don't know, in this case, how much of that has to do with supply chain. Would have MSI done an AMD model if they could get their share of chips? I don't know. So this one at the moment is Intel only, as far as I know.
So a lot of the problem that you're seeing with these shortages is absolutely due to the fact that AMD is trying to penetrate and doing a very good job into the OEM desktop market. So OEM desktops, as opposed to the chip that they sell like this to us, to enthusiasts, to us, right? This is probably about 30% of the chips of the addressable market that they sell to. If you get into OEM sales, into like OEM desktops, that's like 70% or more of the actual market. So for AMD, in order to grow, they need to sell more chips to OEMs. That is imperative. They've even stated this. Lisa Su says it all the time. But those OEMs demand supply. So when they have contracts and stuff like that, AMD, in order to convince them to stick with them and continue to offer these pre-builds, they have to give them chips. So right now, those commercial contracts and server contracts, which use the same dies, the same functional components that you find in AMD's 5900X, et cetera, all of their 5000 series, both their server and their commercial product lines are being prioritized. So if the choice comes down to, for AMD, if it comes down to, do I send this 5900X to to retail in a box, or do I send it to an OEM to put in a desktop? That there's no question where that chip is going. It is going to the OEM, and that's a big part of why you're seeing shortages at Amazon and such.
And that's also a big. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
So I was going to say, just to answer your question, there is a different desktop from MSI that is very similar. It uses the airflow case instead of the glass front case, called the Aegis ZS, that goes up to the 5800X, but is technically a different model.
I see. So do you have the price for the model you reviewed that you just RS11th?
Sure. So I saw it. I mean, when you get it with the i7 and the RTX 3080, 16 gigs, that's $24.99 is configured. And when I was reviewing it, they were finalizing, massaging the rest of the line, but they were expecting it to start at about 2,000 flat. And that one would have like a 3070 and a 650 watt would ditch the hard drive storage, and that it could go up a little higher, up to the i9 11900K and 39 and a 3090 and 32 gigabytes of RAMs, and that would be probably somewhere around $3,900. And then there's also the case of the motherboard, which is an interesting thing, in that so the one we had the Z590, but they suggested that some SKUs might have the Z490 for a little bit, at least until the Z590 supply levels out, and then everything would go up to the Z590. So if you see a model you like and it doesn't have the Z590 and you're waiting for that, it might come eventually.
So it sounds like there's, well, you tell me, and you don't have to give away any secrets as to your future reviews or anything, but in terms of availability of desktops with the latest gen CPUs, it seems like there are some decent number of options. Is that fair?
I think we've noticed in general that while the parts are still hard to find, and a lot of desktops have been going fast, but there have been some companies, Dell is definitely one of them, that have managed to hold on to stock of things like the RTX 3080. And for instance, they've been selling their Auroras fairly consistently, all things considered, throughout the shortage of parts. You can get a desktop if you want one, but you may have to spend but it's on the top end, right? We don't have a lot of new entry level ones yet. So you'll have to spend a pretty penny, and it may end up coming out a little cheaper than if you built it yourself at the moment, just because of how high Amazon and eBay prices are right now. There are options, probably more on Intel, and probably for the Intel ones, more coming this month and next month, as the chip really hits the market.
Yeah, so keep your eyes peeled for that if you're willing to go pre-built, because that's just been so dismal. Looking for parts for the past, over a year, I guess, by now.
Yeah, but if you're an enthusiast looking for a pre-built, definitely get one like this that is made of all standardized parts, including the case. That's so important for future upgradability. If you plan on keeping this case for a while and swapping out parts, as much as I like the look of the Alienware Aurora, there's not a lot of room for upgrading there. While here you have plenty. Later on, you could change your cooler. Maybe you want to mount the cooler on the top instead of the back. There's flexibility. The side panel comes off like any other normal side panel because it's a regular case. And there's a couple companies that do ones like this. Corsair makes a lot of them like this. HP's Omen is okay like that. Some of the back is a little bit harder to reach. But you got to make sure, if you're going this way because you want to be able to upgrade later, but you can't find all your parts now, just make sure you get something with a normal case. That's all I beg of you.
We'll do our best, Andrew. So it looks like we have time for some questions. So if you haven't put in a question yet and want to, now is your chance. We have a comment from Naomi who says, "Oh, alert! Micro Center has the 5600X in stock at MSRP, but you have to pick it up in store." So that's good to know. But Naomi is asking, or says, my sister's 3600 is rocking games still. So is it really worth the $100 price increase to go get the 5600X? I always feel like if they're happy with what you're doing and what you're playing and you have your satisfactory performance as is, keep it as is. Also, it's for your sister. It's not even for yourself. So, but let's see what do you guys think?
I think that if it's doing what you need it to do now, unless you have an upgrade to your unless you're going to upgrade the GPU in the near future, at which point, of course, a faster chip is going to help you at that point. But with the combination of hardware that you have right now, if you're not planning to upgrade a GPU anytime soon, and you probably shouldn't be right now, stick with what works. Maybe if you want to start doing streaming and the 3600 isn't doing enough there, or maybe if there's some other aspect that isn't necessarily meeting your needs, then sure, it's worth an upgrade. But otherwise, just roll with it, especially right now.
Yeah.
Right now.
It's funny though.
True.
It's funny when I started working here, I started realizing how many people are so passionate about this, and like some people do upgrade every year, and it started making me wonder, like, am I behind? Am I behind? And then I realized everything I have is doing the work I needed to do right now. So, like Paul said, if it's doing what you need to do right now, like, why are you going to go out and spend that money? I'm sure Intel and AMD would love for you to buy the new chip every single year, but these things could easily last 5-6 years if, for most people.
Yeah, you look at the time-honored tradition for enthusiasts is to hold on to a CPU from anywhere from 5 to 7 years, and then but GPUs is almost a yearly, well, a year and a half, depending upon what's out there. If there are big generational gains, GPUs, you should be more focused if you're really focused on gaming on refreshing your GPU at a faster cadence. I mean, there's still people with 2500Ks overclocked. We're on the 11th gen, a 2500K is second gen, and they're pairing them with pretty good GPUs to this day. So just bear that in mind. That 3600 will get you pretty far.
And so if you have like around $100 to spare and you want to upgrade your sister's gaming experience, I don't know, get like an $80 good mechanical keyboard, and she'll feel better like pressing the keys and the interactive part of it. You got $20 left over, buy her a sandwich. You did her good. So there's some other ways you can upgrade your gaming. My point being, besides going for the chip, if you have some wiggle room in your budget.
Yeah, like one of the things, just as a personal aside, one of the biggest upgrades I've ever made, I change components constantly in my rigs. I'm always on the bleeding edge, of course, but I had the same monitor for like 8 years. Somebody's like, man, you should just buy this monitor. It was like a Dell 30-inch monitor back in the day. It cost $1,000. I'm like, crazy. That's crazy. And he pointed out, he said, look, what do you actually look at? It's the only thing you haven't upgraded is the one thing that you actually look at. And I bought that monitor. It's probably one of the biggest upgrades I've done in a long, long time. So yeah, there's definitely other ways to improve your experience. I mean, think about the thing you're looking at. A good monitor can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I look a lot better on a nicer monitor. It's your monitor's fault. It's not what I look like. Anyway, Rurutu also has a comment on that. They asked, what's your monitor's refresh rate? If it's 1080p at 60 hertz, don't even bother with upgrading your CPU or GPU. I guess because you don't need the extra power is what they're saying. So yeah, I think you're good, Naomi. Get your sister a keyboard is what I say.
Well, there are some caveats. Rurutu is, if that's how we say it, is largely correct. Yes, faster GPUs will have better frame pacing and better 99 percentiles and stuff like that you can actually notice on a 60 FPS. Maybe just not in raw frame outputs, but there are other advantages. But they're a little more subtle. So it's generally, he or she or this person is correct.
It's a fox, Paul.
It's a fox. Fox is correct.
So what else do we have? Talking cores here. Don't you think that with the price of 8-core CPUs, that 6 cores are going to stay mainstream for a while?
I would say yeah. Well, it's a tough call. I mean,
I guess it depends on what you're doing, right?
Well, there's that, but also it depends on what cores we're talking about. Are we talking about Skylake cores? Are we talking about Rocket Lake cores? Are we talking about Zen 3? I mean, the cores are different. You can't necessarily equate X number of cores because, as we've seen, Intel just came out with an 8-core that is very, very close to its 10-core. So the cores are faster. So it's kind of hard to answer that.
It's also, I mean, you were talking about the big little stuff coming as soon as like the next generation. That's how we count cores, like how you already see cores being counted in terms of like Apple's M1 with like your high performance versus low performance cores. There's going to be a lot of different types of cores to talk about very soon.
Correct. It's going to be an entirely new paradigm. It is a massive risk by Intel to take that mainstream. It is going to be quite interesting. It's coming soon. It is coming soon by the end of the year. Alder Lake. So
Paul's going to be busy.
Yeah, that'll be the big one.
So apologies to Rurutu. They are actually a red panda.
Red panda, sorry.
I believe I've made that mistake before. So My bad. So we also have a comment. Where did it go? I'm going to find it. Here it is. Norman Gange said, I'm buying the i9-11900K for PCIe 4 and Intel stability and reliability. I was curious. So is this the first time we're seeing PCIe 4 on Intel desktop?
Correct. But just so that you know, it does come with a caveat. You only get PCIe 4.0 to your graphics card and to one M.2 slot. Any additional M.2 slots beyond the first one are only going to be PCIe 3.0. So Intel does have PCIe 4.0 support, but it's not like AMD's, because basically they ran into problems with their chipset. As a matter of fact, I read about this the last time I was at Computex, I think 2 years ago.
Yeah.
We wrote about it all the way back then because these things take so long to come through. They're working on them for years, but we got the scoop on that one, is that they had problems with their PCIe 4.0 on the chipset. So 2 years ago, we told you that the chipset would not come with PCIe 4.0, and that's exactly what happened. 3 days ago, it launched. The chip itself supports PCIe 4, but the chipset does not. So any devices that you connect to the PCIe or to the chipset that hang off the chipset, like additional M.2 lanes, are only going to operate at PCIe 3.0. So just keep that in mind. I mean, most people probably aren't going to be running a whole bunch of M.2s at PCIe 4.0, but it is a consideration. So, Intel's stability and reliability is a very common and fair comment that a lot of people do make, that is why they choose Intel. So, AMD has been largely stable, but, they have had problems, but by the same token, Intel has too. But I think those are fair reasons to buy it. If that's what you trust, that's what you should buy.
Do you see the addition of PCIe 4 being a big deal from the desktop perspective, Andrew, as someone who reviews pre-built desktops?
Well, I mean, it's nice. It's funny. The PCIe Gen 4 SSD that came with this was just kind of whatever, which was kind of disappointing. I don't know how big that's going to be for the pre-built market. And I mean, look, it's great. I think end users will notice this. They'll bring these home, or they'll get them shipped to their home, and they'll say, wow, this is fast. But I don't think if you go to like Best Buy's website or something, you go to Amazon's website, the average person looking for something pre-built, that's going to be the top thing on their list that they're going to notice and know what that means, as opposed to seeing certain brand names. They recognize their model names as CPU and GPU. For the enthusiast who's looking, they'll notice, and they're starting to creep into the desktop market. They started to do it really when AMD supported it, and now that Intel supports it, basically everyone is offering something. But if for the enthusiast market, a lot of them still want to build, right? For the average, Joe and Betty Best Buy who are just going in there, I don't think they're going to be like, oh, I have to get that one because it's going to load my game a little quicker. So it's a bit of a mix.
Fair. And I think we have time for at least one more question. It's actually for Paul. Somebody would like to know if you've used the program Clock Tuner before for, I assume, overclocking Ryzen chips.
Okay, your CTR, is that what you're referring to? Yeah, CTR from I forget his name. His name. It's a little like a community. He designed that.
Acronyms make things so much easier.
I have mixed feelings about CTR. The CTR, I have used it quite a while back, but the problem is that what it does is it will test your CPU and try to find the correct clocks and voltages that will work for your specific chip. I have found that during stress testing, it pumps an incredible amount of voltage at times to the cores, and I don't think that it's tenable, and I'm not entirely convinced that it is safe. I know that I'm not alone in this opinion. It has received at least there's been a lot of commentary about that in enthusiast forums and Reddit and various areas. I believe that CTR, personally, I think that in my experience, CTR is no better than what AMD offers you with Precision Boost Overdrive. I would advise people to stick with Precision Boost Overdrive. If you take the time to learn to use Precision Boost Overdrive correctly, especially if you, what is the name of the setting? Precision Boost Overdrive, when you use it normally, it doesn't change one setting. It's scalar. Okay, scalar can go from 1 to 10x, and that's how long the CPU stays in boost. Precision Boost Overdrive as an automatic feature does not adjust scalar. So if you go into your BIOS and you turn on Precision Boost Overdrive and you adjust scalar, you're going to be a lot better. I mean, in my opinion, a lot better off than CTR. I mean, I haven't used it in a while, so I want to be a little bit reserved about my recommendation. But if there is something that is just as good from the vendor that makes the chip, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that anybody knows how to tune AMD's chips better than the people who made it.
All right. So if you are still hungry for more after all that, I bet you are. Definitely check out the reviews on tomshardware.com. So Paul tested the i9-11900K and i5-11600K. You can find that review, those chips reviewed together on the site. And Andrew's desktop, awesome right now if you're looking for new components like at all. That has i7-11700K and an RTX 3080. So some rare pieces there. Check out that review. MSI Aegis RS11. Learned a new word today, no big. So thank you to everyone for your questions and your great comments. Love hanging out with you. Definitely like us on Facebook or YouTube if you feel the same. And don't forget to download the show as a podcast afterwards if you'd like. So Paul Alcorn, thank you so much for joining us. And Andrew Friedman, loved having you guys. Check out their reviews. They're great. And that's our show, everyone. Thank you. We'll see you next Thursday.
See you.